The port of New Orleans was the busiest port in the Gulf of Mexico, starting in the 18th century. By the mid-19th century, it was one of the busiest in the United States. Thousands of vessels called New Orleans home as their home port and were officially licensed and registered there. The records of those vessels, numbering into the thousands, are in the U.S. National Archives, as are myriad documents that speak to voyages that once connected New Orleans to the rest of the world by water. The records also document the loss of a number of those vessels, as do records from other ports, both in the U.S. and abroad, for vessels that were registered, sailed from, and in some cases, never returned to their home port. These include vessels that were well known in their time, but also many vessels that, with their crews, worked hard in ocean trades, carrying cargoes, passengers, or fishing, humble craft worked by crews of many races and nations, some of them families, who went to sea because they had a job to do to make a living. There was no such thing as a sick day for those who worked on ships in the 19th century. You simply had to go out. It was understood that you might not ever come back. Sometimes, surveys in the Gulf find shipwrecks that have nothing to specifically identify them. No name, no visible sign of the work they were doing, or whether there were survivors. Reminders of hard work on an often unforgiving sea. In 2001, a survey of the seabed well out to sea and off the mouth of the Mississippi encountered a copper-sheathed lower hull of a wooden sailing vessel.
Possibly the most important thing to be said about the Mica wreck is this was one of the earlier ships that we have found in the Gulf. It was sheathed in almost pure copper, which speaks to the fact that it was early in the period when this technology was first developed as a means of protecting it from shipworms and fouling.
The surviving fittings for its rigging suggested that this had been the most common type of 19th century vessel in the Gulf, a two-masted schooner, now lying in the darkness and filled with silt. The form of the hull, that is, the shape of it, was consistent with wooden schooners of the first decades of the 19th century, and, based on the physical evidence, archaeologists suspect that this vessel had been built around 1825. The evidence also spoke to a violent end, probably in a storm. The Gulf of Mexico is well known for its storms, including violent hurricanes that swept the seas clean of ships and devastated coastal communities. As recent hurricanes have shown, even in our modern age of satellite imagery and forecasts, hurricanes still wreak tremendous damage across the region. The evidence of a violent end includes the fact that the wreck has no rudder, which would have been essential to help steer it, but also a hawse pipe, the fittings at the bow that the anchor cables passed through, and rope in those days instead of chain, was made of lead, and it bore the unmistakable marks of having been hacked at with an axe. This suggests to us that during the sinking, the anchor cable, with the anchor attached, came free and started pulling the bow down. Fighting heavy seas that swept across the decks, someone crawled out in a valiant attempt to save the ship.
And they were attempting to free themselves from the anchors by cutting the line with an axe. So it speaks perhaps to the panic of the crew at the time they were sinking.
That effort was in vain. The schooner sank, and in heavy seas, even if a small boat could have gotten away, or with the crew left struggling to stay afloat, no one would survive for long unless another vessel was close by and came to the rescue. There is no trace of what it was carrying. The wreck may have been full of a cargo that has disappeared, or was sailing in ballast, that is, with no cargo, perhaps heading to a port to load one and return home. The well-preserved lower hull may hold traces of cargo, however, and archaeologists have suggested that a limited excavation to learn more about the wreck might yield traces. For now, archaeologists believe the schooner probably sailed on the transatlantic route to Europe or to one of the ports of the Atlantic coast of the northern states. But they cannot completely eliminate the possibility it was one of many ships engaged in the coffee, sugar, or flour trade of the South Gulf and/or Caribbean regions in the early to mid-19th century.